The man running America's top law enforcement agency couldn't answer the one question that defines everything this country stands for. Not about money, not about power, about the Constitution itself. And when Senator Jeff Merkley leaned forward and asked, "Have you even read it?" the room went silent. You could feel it, the kind of silence that doesn't just hang in the air, it burns. Because this wasn't political theater. It was a moment that showed just how fragile accountability becomes when power forgets its own limits. What began as a routine hearing over budget numbers suddenly turned into a national moment of truth. Merkley started with polite questions, numbers, funding, bureaucratic talk. But beneath his calm tone, something was brewing.
Committee to add funds, add $1 billion, or to cut half a billion dollars?
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate the opportunity. What I'm asking for is that with more, I can simply do more. And I was giving examples of what more I could do. I can do the mission and am in support of the budget here, and I'm working with appropriators and you to fill the gaps.
So you support the budget presented that cuts half a billion, but you also support us adding $1 billion should we choose to do that?
Well, I can't not support the budget as proposed because then I would be supporting no budget.
Okay. Well, we've got those two options. We do look forward to further details from you about how you plan to modify the function of FBI on these different missions that you've highlighted today so that we can give it the appropriate consideration. Mm-hmm. Director Patel, you're familiar with the Fifth Amendment.
Yes, Senator.
And it is really the freedom clause of the United States. It was 4 years into being a nation when Congress and the states said, hey, we have to make sure that there's not an over-aggressive government in the future that deprives us of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And you're familiar that that applies to all persons in the United States.
Yes, Senator.
So there's been a lot of concern about the several hundred immigrants who were swept off the streets of America and sent to El Salvador without due process. And does that concern you?
Senator, I'm not in a position to comment on whether or not they were given or not given due process or are supposed to be afforded due process. All the FBI did and all the FBI will continue to do is arrest those that have violated the law.
Okay, but to arrest, you have to investigate. Have you launched an investigation of this violation of the Freedom Clause of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, I don't know that I agree with your characterization.
Well, that was my first question, whether or not you agree with the Fifth Amendment and are prepared to defend it. It is your job to investigate crimes.
Yes, I agree with the Fifth Amendment. I agree with the entire Constitution, and the men and women at the FBI decide.
So are you going to launch an investigation of the reported violation of the due process of several hundred individuals?
Again, Senator, it's not for me to call the balls and strikes on it. The men and women at the FBI who are trained to open investigations will make those calls.
So you have no influence over whether an investigation is opened?
I have influence over it, but you're asking me a constitutional question. I'm not a constitutional scholar.
Well, it's actually not it's a question also of law.
But your position is that every one of those individuals is by constitutional right afforded due process. I don't know the answer to that. I'm telling you.
You haven't read the Constitution? It says all persons.
I've got it right here, but what you're saying is that every single one of the illegals that was sent down to El Salvador is supposed to be given due process pursuant.
Yeah, that's what the Constitution says. It says no person.
It doesn't say that.
It does say no person. Yeah, I'll encourage you to read it because it's also been affirmed by the Supreme Court repeatedly. In the case of Miranda versus Arizona, held the right of all individuals, regardless of citizenship status, the Supreme Court in Reno versus Flores. I mean, but it's the plain language of the Constitution. It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons as written in black and white in the Constitution.
As the first public defender who's ever served at the FBI as its director, I am more aware of due process than any predecessor in my seat. You are delineating between removal proceedings and criminal acts. My job is to investigate criminal acts. That's what we do.
You are aware that the Fifth Amendment refers to taking away liberty, and when people are arrested on the street, detained, and sent out of the country, that their liberty has been taken away.
Senator, that is a constitutional question that you are asking me to answer. It's not for me to answer.
The question has already been answered by the Supreme Court that they're protected. Therefore, it's a violation of law, and it's your responsibility to open an investigation. And you're saying today you will not do so?
I am not the agency involved in removal proceedings. That is a different branch of government.
So if an agency other than the FBI violates the law and the Constitution, you will not investigate because it's a different agency?
I will investigate every violation of law.
Well, you have, but you just said you're not investigating.
No. You and I are in disagreement on what is a violation of law. I have yet to hear from the Supreme Court your position as you have adjudicated it.
Well, very, very interesting, because the Supreme Court's been very clear, and I had heard you were trained in the law, so I expected maybe you would try to uphold it. You also took an oath to the Constitution.
Thank you for the reminder.
Well, it's important to remind you, since you're apparently unfamiliar with the very basics of the core protection of freedom in our Constitution.
What I am familiar with is protecting the American public, and that's what
Let me close with one question, Mr. Chairman. Will you make sure that due process in every action of the FBI is completely honored under your time as director?
Will I ensure that due process is followed?
Yes.
Under the Constitution?
Completely. Send that message throughout the FBI that due process must be followed, is constitutionally required. Make sure that it's done under your direction.
Sure.
Great. Thank you.
He was leading to a question every American should care about. Because when the director of the FBI, Kash Patel, says he supports the budget and at the same time wants more money, that's confusing, but not alarming. What came next was, Merkley paused, adjusted his glasses, and asked the question that stripped away all the formality. Director, are you familiar with the Fifth Amendment? That single line changed the tone instantly. It wasn't a trick question, not some political trap. It was a test of principle. The Fifth Amendment isn't obscure or complicated. It's the heartbeat of fairness in America. The promise that no person can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It's written clearly, not in legal jargon, but in language every citizen can understand. Yet when Patel stumbled, when he hesitated to affirm one of the simplest truths in our Constitution, it wasn't just uncomfortable. It was alarming. Merkley didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm was sharper than anger. You're familiar with that it applies to all persons, correct? He asked. Patel replied, yes, Senator. But then came the moment where everything cracked. Merkley brought up reports. Hundreds of immigrants, swept from the streets of America, deported to El Salvador without hearings, without a chance to speak. He asked if that concerned the FBI director. And instead of defending the Constitution, Patel said he wasn't in a position to comment. Not in a position to comment on due process. That's when the senator's patience gave way to disbelief. He leaned in again, his tone cutting through the formal silence. Have you even read the Constitution? The air shifted. Cameras zoomed in. This wasn't just about deportation. It was about the meaning of justice itself. Let's pause here. Because if the head of the FBI, a man sworn to uphold the law, can't clearly affirm one of the most basic principles of that law, what does that say about where we are? It's not about sides or parties or ideology. It's about the rule of law. The Fifth Amendment isn't a suggestion. It's a safeguard. It was written to stop governments from doing exactly what Merkley described, stripping people of freedom without due process. The word person was chosen deliberately by the framers, not citizen. Because justice, by design, was meant to protect anyone under U.S. jurisdiction. Patel's answers, or lack thereof, revealed something deeper than confusion. It showed a dangerous kind of detachment, where legal responsibility becomes someone else's problem. It's not for me to call balls and strikes, he said, a phrase that might sound cautious, but in a democracy, it's chilling. Because every erosion of liberty begins with those 6 words. It's not my job. Merkley pressed harder. To arrest, you have to investigate, he said. Have you launched an investigation into this violation of due process? Patel responded, I don't agree with your characterization. It was a bureaucratic dodge to a moral question, a deflection from duty. The Constitution doesn't bend to interpretation when it comes to basic rights. It's black and white. No person, no matter who they are, should lose their liberty without a fair hearing. The senator reminded him of Supreme Court cases like Miranda versus Arizona and Reno versus Flores. The contrast couldn't be sharper. On one side, the clarity of constitutional law. On the other, the clouded uncertainty of the man tasked with enforcing it. Patel tried to defend himself, saying he was the first public defender to lead the FBI and understood due process deeply. But his words didn't match his actions. Merkley wasn't questioning his resume. He was questioning his conviction. The moment hit its breaking point when Merkley said, "It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons as written in black and white." Patel, visibly irritated, replied, "Thank you for the reminder." The room froze again. Because that wasn't gratitude, it was deflection. And that's when the meaning of this exchange became painfully clear. This wasn't about law. It was about leadership. You don't need to be a constitutional scholar to recognize injustice. You just need to care enough to see it. When someone in Patel's position hides behind formality, it doesn't just show weakness, it reveals fear. Fear of accountability, fear of moral clarity. Merkley wasn't attacking Patel. He was defending the very foundation of the country. And yet, the deeper danger here isn't one man's confusion. It's what that confusion represents. When the people at the top start to see the Constitution as optional or as a talking point instead of a promise, the entire system trembles. Because due process isn't just a legal term. It's the firewall between democracy and tyranny. The minute it's ignored for one group, it becomes vulnerable for everyone. That's what makes this exchange more than a viral clip. It's a warning. Every government that's drifted toward abuse began the same way, with officials deciding who counts as a person under the law. And each time, it started with quiet justifications. It's not our department. It's not my jurisdiction. It's not clear. Those words have destroyed more rights than open corruption ever could. Merkley's persistence reminded the country that the Constitution doesn't bend to convenience. When Patel said he'd investigate every violation of law but refused to call this one a violation, the contradiction was clear. The senator wasn't just exposing confusion. He was showing us what moral drift looks like. A slow, bureaucratic decay where responsibility becomes paperwork and principle becomes politics. And here's the irony that hits hardest. Patel said, "I have it right here," referring to the Constitution. He held it in his hand as proof of loyalty. But the Constitution isn't a prop, it's a practice. Holding it doesn't mean you live by it. Understanding it means nothing if you don't act on it. Merkley's reply, "I encourage you to read it," was more than sarcasm. It was a mirror held up to power, a reminder that symbolism without substance is hollow. What makes this moment unforgettable isn't the shouting match or political tension. It's that simple truth. Knowledge of the law means nothing without the courage to apply it. America was built on the idea that power must answer to principle. But when the people who hold that power begin to see themselves above the document they swore to defend, democracy quietly starts to rot from within. Merkley's voice carried the weight of every public defender, every protester, every citizen who ever believed the system could still be fair. "Will you ensure that due process is followed under your direction?" he asked one last time. Patel finally answered, "Sure." One word. Flat. Perfunctory, stripped of conviction. It sounded less like a promise and more like an escape route. And that's what makes this hearing so haunting. Not because it was explosive, but because it was hollow. It showed how easily moral certainty can be replaced with procedural safety. How the people meant to protect justice can lose sight of it in the fog of power. When officials start treating the Constitution as an inconvenience instead of a command, it's not just a failure of leadership, it's a fracture in the system itself. Merkley didn't just challenge Patel. He reminded every viewer of what's at stake. The Constitution isn't self-enforcing. It lives only through the people willing to defend it. Every right we have exists because someone demanded it, someone questioned authority, someone refused to accept "not my job" as an answer. And here's the real takeaway. This wasn't just about deportations or hearings. It was about who decides what justice means. If due process can be ignored for one group today, it can be ignored for anyone tomorrow. That's not speculation. That's history repeating itself. Every time a government starts deciding who deserves rights, freedom becomes selective. Merkley's frustration in that moment wasn't political, it was patriotic. You could see it in his eyes. He wasn't grandstanding. He was warning. Because when those sworn to uphold the law forget what the law actually says, the system doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes slowly, decision by decision, silence by silence. And yet, the most chilling part wasn't Patel's uncertainty. It was the realization that millions watching might shrug it off. That's how accountability dies. Not with outrage, but with apathy. Because power only becomes dangerous when people stop paying attention. The truth is, this wasn't about left or right. It was about right and wrong. Merkley reminded the country that constitutional principles aren't up for debate. They're the very reason debate is even possible. The Fifth Amendment isn't abstract. It's the moral foundation of equality before the law. Without it, justice becomes a privilege, not a right. When Patel said, "I'm not a constitutional scholar," he might have thought he was dodging a question. But what he really did was answer one. Because in that moment, he showed us exactly why hearings like this matter. To remind those in power and those watching that understanding the law isn't enough. You have to live it, and that's where you come in. Because democracy doesn't survive on hearings or speeches, it survives on awareness. On people who refuse to look away. On citizens who demand that the law apply equally to everyone. No exceptions to so if you're watching this, remember, the Constitution isn't just a piece of paper. It's a contract between the people and their government. Every time it's ignored, that contract weakens. And every time we call it out, it strengthens. That's why this moment matters. Because accountability only exists when someone has the courage to ask, "Have you even read the Constitution?" And when that question echoes through the halls of power, it reminds everyone listening what the word justice truly means. That if you believe in that principle, if you believe that no one, not even the most powerful, should be above the law, then stay engaged. Subscribe, like this video, and share it. Because the more people see moments like this, the harder it becomes for power to hide from principle. And in times like these, staying informed isn't just an act of curiosity, it's an act of courage.